Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone who is watching this panel. This panel will be entirely conducted in English. I will just say one sentence in Portuguese just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Pessoal que está assistindo, essa mesa vai ser toda em inglês. Mas, se vocês compreendem a língua, mas preferem perguntar em português, façam comentários na língua que vocês quiserem. Podem perguntar em português no chat, a gente passa para os nossos palestrantes, ok? Now that I gave this very brief message, we'll move on entirely in English. And this is a panel conducted in English, but we have audience from all around the world. So please go ahead if you understand the English language, but you feel more comfortable asking questions in Portuguese, Spanish, and French, in whatever language you want. You can just write in the chat. If we don't know the language, we'll translate your question, but I'm sure we'll be all right. So I am very happy and honored and flattered and excited because this panel, we have two people who I admire and whose work I admire. I met both of them in in-person conferences. Actually, one of our speakers, Professor Walsh, Dr. Walsh, was the moderator of one of the panels that I participated in the past. So I'm very excited to bring in these people together. And this is a truly global and transnational and transatlantic panel to discuss global Black studies and diasporic studies. So I would like to start introducing Dr. Walsh, Dr. Olden Walsh. I will bring him to the screen right now, and then we can move on to our second panelist, who is Juliet Tawiwa. So if I am mispronouncing your names, please correct me, okay? So here's Dr. Walsh. The correct pronunciation is Walsh, right? Owen Walsh.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Excellent. So I will very briefly introduce Dr. Walsh, and then I will pass the baton because I'm sure that you are here to listen to his work, not to my words. So let's see. Owen Walsh is a historian of U.S. and transnational radicalism in the 20th century. His first book, Frontiers of Black Freedom, West Coast Internationalism and Multiracial Radicalism during the 1930s, is forthcoming with University of Illinois Press. Congratulations. He has previously published essays in Comparative American Studies, Labor History, and Radical Americas. He is a 2026 Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress, which has supported research toward a second monograph project, provisionally titled Insurgent Americana, Radical U.S. Intellectuals and the Mexican Revolution. He is a founder and organizer in the UK American Studies Against the Genocide Network and is a lecturer in modern history at the University of Aberdeen. So thank you very, very much for being here with us, Dr. Walsh. We're all excited to learn more. I personally studied U.S. Black history, Langston Hughes in the 1930s, so I'm very personally interested in your work, but I'm sure our audience is always looking forward to learning from you. So without further ado, please, Dr. Walsh, the floor is yours. I'm going to show you.
Yeah. Oh, perfect.
Yes.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for having me. And I feel like it'd be remiss not to join an event in Brazil from Scotland this week and recognise that it's perhaps not the most opportune week for a Brazilian-Scottish crossover, but hopefully this one ends a bit more happily than that one did for us. Yeah, thanks again for the invite. And this is a paper which is a bit taken from a couple of the bits of it are drawn from a couple of chapters in that book project. So if anybody who finds it interesting, then hopefully you'll pay attention to the book when it's released in the spring of next year. So I'm going to be talking about Arne Berntomps, obviously a close associate of Langston Hughes, as Gabriel knows, a Harlem Renaissance poet and author whose writing, I think, can help us to access some of the complexity of Black ideas about racial authenticity during the mid-20th century. So in particular, I'm interested in the ways that Berntomps engaged the US West and the West Coast especially, as a space of transnational possibility, even as it also remained central to a US nationalist mythology. And so I'm looking at some of these tensions and relationships between the West as a transnational Black space and the West as a space full of US nationalist symbology. So during the period of the Great Migration, of course, millions of African Americans moved out of rural sharecropping and Jim Crow's legal jurisdiction and into industrial centers, mostly in the so-called Free North, And in that process, discussions of racial identity often hinged on an understanding of the US South as the immediate source of authentic Blackness. So for the New Negro generation that followed on from the First World War, the South represented a kind of vernacular approximation of the less accessible and original source of racial authenticity, Africa. The US South then, as the site of Black enslavement, linked African Americans to Africa, but it also provided a metonym for Black rootedness and belonging in the United States. So to quote from J. Martin Favor, it was, quote, the seat of authentic American Blackness. The paradigms through which intellectuals came to understand Blackness during the interwar years was therefore shaped by understandings of region. American regionality had some kind of relationship to ideas about Blackness and its authenticity or inauthenticity. Debates about Blackness, Americanness, and Africanity rested on multiple writers' identification of authentic Blackness with the rural folk of the American South. Black agricultural workers in the American South exemplified the syncretism between survivals of African culture and the dominant European culture of white America. So, for example, in the influential imaginary of the Communist Party of the USA during the 1930s, when it gained a substantial following among Black Americans, preoccupation with the South as the source of an authentic Blackness was rendered by the communists as a collective striving for national separation, for the formation of a separate nation in the Black Belt in the South. Inherent to that formulation of a Black Belt thesis, but not exclusive to the Communist Party, is obviously a slippage between racial and national communities. In this case, a slippage between Blackness as a racial community and Blackness as a national community. African Americans were represented as both a component part of the American nation, with rightful demands therefore to equal citizenship, and as a distinct national community who had their own public sphere, collective interests, and a distinct position in the global order. According to the scholar Barbara Foley, Black Americans, quote, metonymic nationalism, which connected Blackness to the soil in the American South. This rhetorical maneuver helped to kind of transplant the pioneer myth, which was foundational to US nationalism, onto the African American Great Migration. So according to Barbara Foley, it was by their heroic movement to the north, or by representing their heroic movement to the north, as well as their assertion of a continuous rootedness in the South, that Black Americans were able to stake a full claim on citizenship in the United States. Foley's account then renders Black movement westward as marginal, so the distinctive character of Black migration out to the West is obscured exclusively on migration out of the South and into the free North. And this is a reasonable and compelling argument, but I think that it neglects some of the importance and significance of the American West to the New Negro intellectuals, and especially in writings by figures like Anna Bontemps. What need might Black Americans have, according to Foley, of the American West, if their pioneer status and their Americanness is already achieved when they move to eastern metropolises like New York or Washington, D.C.? So the picture that Foley paints is persuasive, but her account underestimates the significance of the West to New Negro intellectuals. The West was an even more bounteous field for nationalist metonym and metaphor than was the South, albeit in this case, the nationalisms of the West Coast tend to be of a different kind. This wasn't a space which represented a specifically Black Americanness, it was a space which exemplified Americanness par excellence. So the West was, according to one of its most distinguished historians, Patricia Nelson Limerick, it was, quote, the national region most associated with optimism and opportunity, where the gap between expectation and results was a version of the national gap, and a version that was written in bigger, bold-faced and exaggerated type. So while migration to California took Black migrants even further geographically from Mother Africa and, of course, from the South, it brought them to a new region with its own distinct transnational quality and distinct political possibilities too. It was, quote, a crossroads of the Atlantic and the Pacific worlds, shaped by globe-spanning structured transformations and multidirectional entanglements, according to Jan Latty. So to detail or specify what that means, the West Coast is a region that encompasses porous borders with Mexico to the south and Canada to the north. It's also, of course, a gateway to the vast expanse of the Pacific, across which there are migrations of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, and other laborers in this period. The West could be rendered as a synecdoche for the United States as a whole, but it was also a world-facing borderland that was in some sense as much less American in kind of the composition, especially of its laboring population. It was used to represent pre-modern rurality with its dramatic landscapes and its independent farmers, but it also signified a technological modernity that was visible, especially in expanding metropolises and booming industries centered in Los Angeles. In that city, in California's greatest urban sprawl, the formation of racial communities occurred in, quote, a quadrilateral pattern, according to Scott Kurashige, that encompassed, quote, white, black, Asian, and Mexican Americans. So ideologically and economically, the Pacific edge of the American continent was central to US capitalism, and it also was rich with possibilities, imaginative and political possibilities for Black Americans moving out of the South. Given that context, the New Negro impulse to discover an authentic Blackness in the South was not universally felt or uniformly expressed. It varied and was sensitive to regional variations and distinctions. Blackness could look and feel different in a region where African Americans were often the smallest ethnic group and were far from the only group that were racialized as non-white and therefore treated as unwelcome. The peculiar process of racial formation in California and in much of the West opened possibilities for Black Americans to assert their Americanness even more forcefully, often against other racialized groups who were also immigrants like Mexicans or Chinese. It also offered possibilities for them to disidentify from their ethnic background completely and pass as members of some other group, or simply as an opportunity to carve out spaces of free and emancipated spaces of Blackness that were remote from the site of their collective trauma in the South. So occupying a space that was geographically distant from Black communities in the South, but which was so figuratively and literally productive of American capitalism, residents on the West Coast enjoyed distinct opportunities to make themselves, especially as cosmopolitan and worldly subjects, to expand the bounds of Blackness, if you like. Among the cosmopolitan New Negro artists who engaged the West in some of these ways was Arna Bontemps. He wasn't alone, but I'm going to focus on him for the purposes of this presentation. Bontemps' life straddled the South and the West in distinctive and important ways. He was born in Louisiana, but most of Bontemps' early life was spent living in California. First with his family in an area called the Furlough Tract on the edges of Watts County in Los Angeles. And then as a student at Pacific Union College at Nassau County and a post office worker in downtown LA. He was, as a young man in California, an aspiring writer, and he made the move to Harlem in 1924. He joined the New Negro Renaissance and made his name, especially as a poet, but also as a novelist. After having made his name, he moved again to the South, to Huntsville, Alabama, where he published his first novel, God Sends Sunday, and endured some of the intense racial tensions that resulted from the Scottsboro trial ongoing nearby at that time. And as a consequence of the racial tensions and the intense white suspicion and racism of the period, Bontemps left Huntsville, drove his family back out to Watts in California, and lived temporarily with his father, where Bontemps produced an uncharacteristically angry novel of Black revolution in the South, a novel called Black Thunder, which took as its subject Gabriel Prosser's revolt, the slave revolt in Virginia in 1800. Immediately on receiving an advance on his royalties, Bontemps moved his family back out of California to Chicago, where they remained and then eventually ended up in Nashville. So he was migratory through this period, but the West and California especially was an important site for him as the source of his upbringing and later as a refuge from Southern racism. As a writer, Bontemps was uniquely preoccupied with the South, and this is one of the things that comes up a lot in much of the scholarship on him. But he was also closely associated, of course, with Harlem and Chicago. And as I say, he did much of his writing from and or about the West. And when he wrote about the West, Bontemps helped to define what that region meant for Black America. And he explored possibilities there, especially for peaceful coexistence between African Americans and other communities in what has been called a trans-Pacific contact zone in the southwest of the United States. Bontemps' writing complicated commonplace notions that settlement in the West resulted in the loss of an authentic racial self. That is, by removing themselves from the South and moving out to a mostly white or at least a non-Black region like the West, African Americans became less truly Black. Important in that respect was Burne Thompson's invention of a space called Mudtown, which was a settlement that he usually imagined near to Watts. He was basing it on the furlough tract that he grew up in. And he first described Mudtown in an unpublished novel called The Chariot in the Clouds, but it appeared more famously in that debut novel, God Send Sunday, and later again in a book that he co-wrote with the proletarian author Jack Conroy in 1945 called They Seek a City. I'll actually be quoting from a later rewriting of that book from the 1960s called Any Place But Here, but it's basically the same text. So in the first story of Mudtown, in The Chariot in the Clouds, written at the end of the 1920s, this semi-rural town was rendered as, quote, an idealized black space, according to Emily Lutensky. Its pastoral and pre-industrial character carried over into God Send Sunday, where Burne Thompson described, quote, a tiny section of the Deep South literally transplanted, with black folks living uninhibitedly because they were, quote, removed from the influence of white folks. In the later incarnations, Mudtown was given a less localized nature. It became a generic place, a phase almost of life in of American life and culture, where the internal dispersal of African Americans across the country began. So Mudtown then is kind of symbolic of the early phase of Black migration from the South, where movement out of the South doesn't necessarily dim or diminish one's claim to authentic Blackness. And it's usually situated for Burne Thompson on the West Coast. Indeed, in Chariot in the Clouds, when the lead character Alec developed a special, quote, racial patriotism after living for a time in Harlem, that, quote, specific racial feeling was effectively tied to his love for a resident of Mudtown called Beulah. Quote, she was to him his race. More than anyone else, she embodied the complete character of his people. So Burne Thompson saw in this young woman who resided in this West Coast settlement of Mudtown, she saw in her a symbol of Black American tribulations. In these writings, we see that Burne Thompson approached the West as a contradictory space. He imbibed it both with nationalist and with transnational meanings. Even as he portrayed Mudtown as an authentically Black space, he made non-Black and non-American presences visible there. In Chariot in the Clouds, again at the end of the 1920s, one of Burne Thompson's Black characters, Pig, was, quote, always associated with the Mexicans. He, quote, looked much like a Mexican himself and was frequently taken for one, and he marries a Mexican woman called Chona. This intercultural connection doesn't diminish Pig's Blackness. However well he adapted to Mexican food, quote, a tortilla against one of Mars' biscuits was just no match. Burne Thompson also rendered Los Angeles as multi-ethnic. So, for example, in the same story, he recognizes the presence of a Chinese community who are involved in an illicit gambling operation that the local residents enjoy. Indeed, Mudtown didn't have to be located in the United States at all. In a letter to his close friend, Langston Hughes, Burne Thompson referred to a, quote, little Mudtown near a relative's ranch outside Ensenada in Baja California in Mexico. In Burne Thompson's later writing, the multi-ethnic character of Western Black settlements takes on a more nostalgic and an idyllic quality. So some of his later writing, Burne Thompson is producing in the aftermath of the 1965 Watts riots, where Burne Thompson is kind of looking back nostalgically on Black settlement in the West before the creation of a, quote, Black ghetto. And he's projecting utopian pasts as well as alternative futures for African Americans in California. In the 1968 introduction to Black Thunder, for instance, he wrote that in the Watts of 1934 that he recalled writing the novel in, there existed, quote, frustrations, but unlike in 1965, they remained dormant. Instead, the town that Burne Thompson knew in the Depression years was a peaceful and interracial community where Burne Thompson's family lived opposite, quote, a vacant lot where a friendly Mexican neighbor grazed his milk goat, and the house bordered a Japanese truck farmer's asparagus field. Quote, the air was like transparent gold in those days. The implication then is of a simple and pre-industrial life that has been lost to hardening racial geographies in the vicinity of Los Angeles. Burne Thompson's writing about utopian possibilities in the West wasn't just backward-looking and nostalgic, though. It could also take on more modernist iterations. In Any Place But Here, he envisioned public housing in the Furlong Tract as a social democratic utopia. So there, around Watts in 1941, the National Housing Administration developed a housing project known as Pueblo del Rio, where, according to Burne Thompson, residents enjoyed a life of interracial mingling and intercultural cohesion. Quote, Negro, Mexican, white, and Filipino children played in a wading pool, thoroughly integrated by the architectural design of the Black architect Paul R. Williams. Byrne Thomas describes a full community life with, quote, classes in home art and family living, lawns and garden, day nurseries and playgrounds. All of this replacing the, quote, tumble-down verandas of his childhood. In this narrative, Byrne Thomas rediscovers the racial frontier as a place of unique cultural mixture and of racial freedom, and he rediscovers it in the urban geography created by the New Deal state. The southwestern borderlands then once again offer unique opportunities for some interdiasporic connections and communities and for interracial living, courtesy of an American variation on social democratic reformism. It's impossible here, I think, to ignore the centrality of nationalistic conceptions, US nationalist conceptions, in Byrne Thomas's vision of a utopian West. In describing the Pueblo del Rio housing administration as an idyll, utopia's existence was owed to the intervention of the US state, and Byrne Thomas glosses American New Deal nationalism as replete with progressive potential for intercultural and interracial mixture. More generally, in any place but here, Byrne Thomas and Conroy represent Black internal migration as an Americanizing process. The migration out of the South, Byrne Thomas says, has a deep meaning for all America. And just as every man who went west had his own personal reasons, so every Negro who left the South was motivated by a set of circumstances peculiar to himself. So in Byrne Thomas's reconciliation of transnational and US nationalist meanings of the West, a more radical critique of the US as a settler colonial project is being lost. The only indigenous presence, notably in his reminiscences about California, is in the prologue to Any Place But Here. Here, Byrne Thomas described a Black resident of the furlough tract named Red Eagle, who, quote, had grown up and lived most of his life among Indians in Oklahoma and had worked as a cowboy. The figure of Red Eagle isn't used to offer any consideration of settler colonialism. There's no reflection on the life of Indians in Oklahoma or elsewhere. Instead, it leads to a discussion of Black cowboys, where those cowboys are treated in familiar terms as kind of romantic heroes of the West, who are nevertheless unfortunately treated by their white compatriots to terrible racism. So the focus remains fairly narrowly then on anti-Black racism in the West, rather than on any settler colonial process or process of Indian displacement. Byrne Thomas's writing then is instructive in a few ways around how we ought to read New Negro literature and also how we ought to understand interwar Black political imaginaries more broadly. Byrne Thomas's racial imaginary was spatialized in ways that are quite complex and that were attentive to the US's regional dynamics and to various racial formations. In particular, the West Coast occupied a distinctive place in his fiction as a site where he could write quite caustically and angrily about Black revolution in the South, but where he also imagined a multiracial escape from white supremacy alongside other minoritized migrants in the United States. This racial imaginary then opened up transnational possibilities and opened up the possibility also of settler colonial critiques. But Byrne Thomas demurred from some of these possibilities and sought to reconcile it instead with a kind of liberal US nationalism of a kind that prevailed through the mid-20th century. Byrne Thomas's work exemplifies then a mode of New Negro discourse that was replete both with oppositional urges toward a transnational and a multiracial and solidaristic imaginary, but also with compromises with kind of hegemonic forms of national belonging and identity. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Walsh, for your presentation. I already have many questions and comments, but let's do something. I'm gonna pass the word to Juliet, and then we can reconvene together for the conversation at the end, okay? So thank you very much for sharing your work with us. I will change the screen now. I will put you back in the backstage, okay? And then I will bring Juliet, but I really appreciate your paper and share your work with us. I will open for the questions at the end. So I believe Juliet is not hearing us, but just 1 second. We're going to solve the technical problems. Give me 1 second. So yeah, Juliet is going to join us in a second because she was not she was not hearing what we were saying. So she will try to leave and join the link again to see if um, it works. Let me see. Okay, Juliet, can you hear me now? Yeah, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, I can now. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, that's totally fine. For some reason, it has happened before as well. People just stop hearing for some reason. I don't know why. But what matters is that it's at working now. So as I said, thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, for sharing your work with us. I will now move to Juliet, who is going to continue our panel with her work. Let me just introduce you very briefly, and then the floor is yours. So I'm very happy to have Juliet here with us, and together with Professor Walsh. And Juliet is a PhD student and a graduate teaching assistant in English at Northern Illinois University. Her research focuses on slavery memory and the material and oral archives of the African diaspora. She's particularly interested in how Black literary texts preserve histories that exceed official records and challenge dominant narratives of racial progress. Her current work examines the role of oral testimony and the diasporic memory in transnational Black writing. So, Juliet, thank you again for being here with us. We are good on time, okay? So, no rush, take your time. And then once you're done, I will bring Dr. Walsh back to the screen and we can all have a conversation with our audience. We have 12 people watching us live, 12 between students and graduate students and faculty, which honestly for Friday afternoon is a wonderful, wonderful audience. We have a good number here. So thank you all for everybody who is watching. And Juliet, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. So the title of my work is Blackness and the Oral Archive, Memory, Africa Town, and Vernacular Preservation in Heston's Barracoon. Okay, so I'd like to begin with a question. What is an archive? Most of us are trained to imagine the archive as a building, a repository filled with documents such as ship manifests, plantation ledgers, government records, and official correspondence. These materials were written down, catalogued, and preserved by institutions that had the authority to decide what counted as history. But this raises an important question. What happens when the people whose histories we want to recover were never meant to leave a paper trail? What happens when the archive itself was produced by the very systems that sought to silence them? These questions sit at the center of Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon, the story of the last Black cargo. Completed in the early 1930s but not published until 2018, the text records the testimony of Oluwale Zola, also known as Kujo Lewis, the last known survivor of the slave ship, the Clotilda. Through Kozola's voice, Hurston preserved something the formal archive rarely allowed. That is, an African man narrating his life in his own dialect and according to his own narrative logic. Scholarly discussions of Barracoon have largely focused on its narrative form, ethnographic significance, and preservation of oral testimony. Deborah Plant emphasizes Hurston's preservation of orality and vernacular speech. Hilgard Huela reads the text in relation to Hurston's narrative strategies and literary production. Others, such as Stephen Pascalina and Raquel Kennan, examine the ethnographic and diasporic dimensions of the work. While these studies illuminate Barracoon's literary and cultural importance, they often interpret the text primarily within Western literary or archival frameworks. In this work, I shift the focus to an African-centered analytical framework. I argue that Barracoon functions as a vernacular archive, a form of cultural preservation grounded in African-centered epistemologies and sustained through language, oral performance, and communal memory. Rather than simply supplementing the historical archive, the text challenges the very definition of what an archive is. To examine this argument, I draw on two theoretical frameworks. The first is Sheila Walker's Afrogenic perspective, which encourages scholars to begin Africa diaspora analysis on its own terms and African cultural continuities rather than from rupture alone. And the second is Kim Butler's theory of diaspora as an ongoing process, which explains how displaced populations transform dispersal into community through collective memory, homeland orientation, and institutional formation. In my analysis, I focus on two interconnected sites where this vernacular archive becomes visible. I first examine language, showing how Kozola's vernacular narration preserves African epistemologies and cultural knowledge through oral performance. Second, I examine Africatown itself as a living archive, arguing that the survivors of the Clotilda deliberately reconstructed African social structures and communal institutions in diaspora. Together, these sites demonstrates that Barakun does more than record testimony. It redefines the archive itself. Before turning to these examples, it is useful to briefly clarify what I mean by a vernacular archive. By this term, I refer to systems of cultural preservation that operate outside formal institutions. These archives are not stored in buildings or cataloged in official repositories. Instead, they are sustained through speech, storytelling, performance, and collective memory. For many African diaspora communities, knowledge has historically been transmitted through oral traditions that prioritize relational communication, repetition, and audience participation. These practices do more than recount past events. They transmit social knowledge, cultural values, and historical consciousness across generations. Approaching Barakun from this perspective, Kozola's testimony becomes more than a personal narrative. It becomes a site where African diasporic knowledge is actively preserved and transmitted. The first place this African-centered archive becomes visible in Barakun is language. Walker's Afrogenic framework directs us to recognize the presence of African linguistic patterns and epistemologies within Kozola's narration, rather than measuring it against standardized English. One of the clearest ways this linguistic archive operates is through naming practices, which in many West African societies encode lineage, history, and cosmology and cosmological meaning. This is especially visible in Kozola's discussion of naming. When Heston addresses Kozola using his African name, his reaction is immediate. Quote, "Oh Lord, I know it's you call my name. Nobody don't call my name from cross the water but you. You always call me Kozola, just like I in the Africa soil." In this moment, the restoration of his name reconnects him to the cultural world from which he was violently separated. Plant explains that Kozola's mother gave him his name because it means, quote, "I do not lose my fruits anymore," end quote. A reference to the deaths of children born before him. The name therefore carries family history, emotional memory, and cosmological significance. So when enslavers renamed him Kojo Lewis, they attempted to sever him from that world entirely. Kozola himself recognizes the cultural difference between African and American naming systems. At one point, he observes, quote, "In the Afiki, we got you one name, but in this place, they tell us we needed two names," end quote. This brief statement reveals a clash between two systems of identity. One system is grounded in lineage, cosmology, and community memory, while the other is grounded in bureaucratic classification. From an Afrogenic perspective, this movement reflects the persistence of African systems of meaning within diaspora. Through naming, Kozola preserves an African-centered understanding of identity that the institutional archive cannot easily record. His storytelling also reflects African oral traditions. Throughout the narrative, Kozola frequently pauses to ask Heston, quote, "You understand me?" End quote. This phrase does more than check comprehension. It creates a participatory relationship between speaker and listener. In many West African storytelling traditions, meaning emerges through interaction between storyteller and audience. Knowledge is transmitted dialogically rather than through a single authoritative voice. Kozola's narrative, therefore, does not simply describe African cultural practices, it performs them. Heston's decision to preserve his dialect was therefore crucial. By refusing to translate his speech into standardized English, Heston protected the linguistic form through which this oral archive is transmitted. This storytelling structure also reflects a different relationship between speaker and listener than we typically find in formal archives. In institutional records, the speaker's voice is often filtered through bureaucratic language or editorial mediation. In Kozola's narrative, however, meaning emerges through interaction. His repeated engagement with Heston invites the listener into the process of remembering, reflecting Butler's concept of diaspora as an ongoing process in which cultural forms are not simply retained, but actively reproduced and adapted in new contexts. In this sense, Kozola is not merely recounting the past, he is performing historical knowledge. The pauses, repetitions, and emotional shifts in his speech recreate the rhythms of oral tradition. Heston's transcription preserves these rhythms rather than smoothing them into standardized literary form. As a result, the text captures not only the content of Kozola's memories, but also the cultural form through which those memories are transmitted. If language represents one side of African cultural continuity, Africa Town itself represents another. Reading the founding of Africa Town through Walker's Afrogenic framework reveals that the Clotilda survivors were not simply adapting to life in the United States. They were actively reconstructing social structures grounded in West African cultural logics. Butler's theory of diaspora helps explain why this reconstruction matters. Butler argues that diasporas emerge when dispersed populations maintain collective ties through shared memory, cultural institutions, and continued orientation toward a homeland. Africa Town represents precisely this process. When the Clotilda survivors realized that going to West Africa was financially impossible, Kozola records their decision in a striking sentence, quote, "We make it the Africa where they fetch us," end quote. This statement captures the transformation Butler describes. Displacement becomes the starting point for diasporic community formation. The survivors sought to recreate their cultural framework in a new geography, and their first step was governance. Kozola explains that they appointed Gumpa as their leader, and this is because he had been a nobleman in Dahomey. They also established judges to resolve disputes. These actions reflect the persistence of African political traditions grounded in lineage-based authority and communal adjudication. The community also pursued collective land ownership. After Timothy Meha, the man who financed the Clotilda voyage, refused to grant them land, the survivors pooled their wages to purchase property together. They built homes collectively and named their settlement Africa Town, rejecting the American name Plateau. Kozola explains that, quote, "We call our village Africa Town. We say that because we want to go back in the Africa soil and we see we can go," end quote. In Butler's terms, this represents homeland orientation. That is, the symbolic relationship to Africa that continues to shape diasporic identity even when physical return is impossible. The community then established institutions designed to sustain this identity across generations. They created systems of communal justice, built their own church, and eventually established their own school. Africa Town was therefore not simply a settlement born of necessity. It was a deliberate project of diasporic community formation grounded in African cultural memory. The history of Barakun's publication reveals another dimension of this archival struggle. Heston completed the manuscript in 1931, yet it remained unpublished for nearly 90 years, and the primary reason was linguistic. Publishers such as Bonney and Viking expressed interest in the manuscript, but insisted that it be rewritten in standardized English rather than Kozole's dialect. Michelle Rolfe-Troiller affirms that archives are shaped by structures of power that determine which voices become legible as historical knowledge. By demanding translation into standardized English, publishers effectively required that Kozole's testimony conform to institutional linguistic forms or norms before it could be accepted as history. Heston unapologetically rejected that demand. By preserving Kozole's speech, she insisted that vernacular language itself carried historical authority. As Saidiya Hartman has argued, the archive of slavery is often shaped by the very violence it records, rendering enslaved voices absent or distorted. Barakun, therefore, represents an alternative archival practice, one that centers oral memory and African diasporic epistemologies as legitimate sources of historical knowledge. I began with the question, what is an archive? And Barakun offers a powerful answer. When read through Walker's Afrogenic perspective and Butler's theory of diaspora as process, the text reveals that the archive of the African diaspora has never been confined to institutional repositories or written documents. It has also existed in voices, memories, dialects, and communities created in the aftermath of displacement. Thank you all.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Julia. That was very interesting. That was great. I'm very happy to be here in this panel today with two works that I'm very interested in. And it's interesting, it's good because these two works are particularly well connected, considering that both of you are dealing with the early 20th century, mid 20th century in the Harlem Renaissance from different perspectives. I will bring Owen back to our screen. Hi, okay, so Dr. Walsh is back. Let me see, Juliet, I think she will try to join us again because she had a problem with the, yeah. Okay, Juliet, can you hear us?
Now I can hear you. I had to go and come back.
Yeah, that's totally fine. We are still trying to figure out why it happens, but what matters is that we are all here. So yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, I'm profoundly grateful for you both being here. I do have a few questions. We have our chat, which is also open. So if anyone wants to ask questions or if anyone wants to see anything, please let me know. We have a comment from George Wilson. Amazing work, and thank you so very much for such elucidating presentations. Thank you very much, George, for being here with us. If you have any questions from the audience, please just write down. But meanwhile, I will start our conversation. So I would like to start with Dr. Walsh's work, just to follow the order. And I'm very interested in this notion of authenticity, right? And the authentic Black. And right at the beginning, you mentioned this notion of the authentic Black as the West South, and what is the authentic Black, and how does the West, how can we situate the West in this conversation? And it made me think, speaking of the Harlem Renaissance, it made me think of how besides Bontemps, how other Harlem Renaissance writers engaged with this notion of authenticity, which in certain way leads us to Juliet's work as well about New Huston. But just to start off with other examples, I immediately thought about Langston Hughes's short story "Slave on the Block." I mean, there are many examples from Hughes, but Langston Hughes has this story in which a white couple from Greenwich Village wants to paint. I mean, the white couple the man, the husband is a musician, and the wife is a painter, and the wife wants to paint a portrait of this black young man who works for them, and she wants to paint him as an enslaved man about to be sold. And there is a very interesting discussion in the short story about what is what how, as Toni Morrison would say, what can the quote white gaze, in Toni Morrison's word, what can these gays do when it tries to portray blackness, right? So this notion of what is authentic. So for this white woman in Hughes's short story, the only authentic way to represent a black man would be as an enslaved man on the verge of being sold, on literally on the block, right? So that's the point. And I mean, there are many other examples. Langston Hughes played with this idea of the quote real blackness and what is authentic, what is not, in many ways in a very ironic way, playing with this imagination of whiteness, right? I also thought about Nella Larson in Quicksand. There is a passage, the protagonist is a light-skinned black woman from the US. She is in Denmark, and then there is this man from Denmark who wants to paint her. It's similar to Langston Hughes. And when he paints, she doesn't even recognize who is in the painting. And the narrator says something, I don't remember the exact sentence, but the narrator said something like, the Danish painter was lost in exoticism, something like it, the exotic way of portraying this woman from the US. So this notion of authenticity is vast and very complex. It has everything to do with language, which connects both works. But what I would like to ask, it's not a one specific question, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you call utopianism in Bontam Multiracial West. So this notion of, you use the word crossroads, if I'm not mistaken, right? So this idea of the West as a connection, it's very interesting to me because when we talk about the Great Migration and Harlem Renaissance more specifically, we constantly talk about New York and Harlem specifically as this melting pot or this crossroads of cultures, and sometimes scholarship on this moment overlooks how the West was also a very interesting crossroads. So if you could discuss a little bit more about this notion of authenticity within the specific context of the West, I think would be very interesting. And then we can move from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I agree that I think you kind of drew out a bunch of the connections really nicely. Yeah, I loved your paper, Juliet. It was great. And yeah, I think it was interesting hearing about it, thinking about Berntom's, because I think so much of Berntom's fiction is animated by a similar kind of like an ethnographic interest actually in kind of discovering or representing like the black cultures in the South in ways that felt true to him. And so I think that he and Hurston were animated by a lot of the same kind of impulses and interests. In terms of the question about the West as a borderland, or sorry, as a crossroads, I mean, there's loads to say about it. I think, I mean, the kind of my book project is addressing this issue of like how we understand the West Coast in the context of this era where there's lots of literature is preoccupied with migration and with transnational connections that are usually rooted through Harlem, and that typically are preoccupied with kind of, various kinds of transatlantic crossings. But I think in that context, the extent to which the West Coast was itself a cosmopolitan space full of migratory laborers, that were also that lots of Black intellectuals were visiting at least, or living in, or had some connections to. I think that gets lost in a lot of those conversations. And so while, like, for example, some of the ways that people like Berntom's talk about the West Coast at times is that they found it too limiting, and that's why they had Harlem. But at the same time, it was really formative for a lot of their kind of cosmopolitan sensibilities. So it, like in that generation, for example, Bontemps obviously was born in California. When he was there, one of the people that he came to know was Wallace Thurman, another major writer of the New Negro movement. Langston Hughes spent a lot of time in the West Coast, especially in the 1930s, producing a lot of his key works, including The Ways of White Folks, which I think is where that short story is from.
Yeah.
So in terms of its significance to the New Negro movement, it was really generative of just like written work. It was an important place for people to kind of retreat to and write. But it was also formative for the kinds of cosmopolitan sensibilities that I think a lot of people brought to Harlem, because it was a space where Black activists and authors were able to encounter and live among Mexican, Chinese, and other kind of communities. It was also a very politicized space because, I mean, there are books like Menace to Empire by Moonho Young, which talks about kind of trans-Pacific radicalism and the importance of, for example, Indian nationalist movements, which were moving across the Pacific and were often based in California and San Francisco through the early 20th century. So there were specific kinds of encounters that were possible on the West Coast. Not to say that similar encounters weren't also possible on the East Coast, but the specific kinds of racial imaginaries that grew out of that context, I think, have been neglected or missed. And Bontemps, as I say, is kind of one instance of this. There's loads more of it in Hughes's work too. One of the things that I address in the same section of the book, but I wasn't able to fit into the presentation, is a short story that Bontemps and Hughes co-author. It's a story for children called Boy on the Border, or Boy Off the Border. It's a story which deploys a lot of these kind of this kind of imagination of like the US Southwest and the Mexican borderlands, and it's kind of in some ways like a didactic story for young, primarily marketed, I would say, at young boys, and it's a story about interracial mixture and interracial friendship, and it's a story about migration across the Mexican border. And so I think there's loads that could potentially be done analytically with that story and with those collaborations between Hughes and Bontemps. I think when people think about both of those figures and they think about transnationalism, they're often thinking about works about Haiti, like Popo and Fifina, or about Hughes's travels in Haiti. The thing about the Caribbean and that kind of transatlantic geography. But I think there's loads to be said about how they live in and imagine and find different kinds of interracial possibilities in the southwestern borderlands.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, this connection between Hughes and Bontemps, even like the letters they exchanged, are very interesting. Right, to see these conversations going on, and actually, speaking of which, since we are here in this global transnational panel, but hosted by the Federal University of Rio. Langston Hughes had a very interesting relationship with Brazil because he did not speak the language and he never went to Brazil, but his work was impressively well known in Brazil since the 1920s. And I found this, I didn't expect that at all, but I found this out doing archival research in Brazil. And I started to find these new papers from like 1928 quoting Hughes already in Brazil, which was very unexpected for me. So throughout in the late 20s, there is one very important modernist magazine, like a modernist literary journal, who quoted Langston Hughes in 1928 in Brazil. They quoted the essay, the Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain. They quoted still in the 1920s. And throughout the 1930s and 40s, there are quite a few references to Hughes's work. And when he passed away in 1967, a lot of journalists and Black activists talked about him in Brazil. And it's funny, I mean, I don't want to go sideways here with that, but just a curiosity. It's funny because in the 1950s, there were at least 2 invitations for him to go to Brazil because they translated his play Mulatto. And they staged this play in Portuguese in Brazil. Two Brazilian playwrights, Abdias Nascimento and Augusto Boal. And they invited Langston Hughes. And there is a mystery in the archive because we have the letters of them inviting Hughes, but Hughes never went for some reason. And then he passed away in 1967. But anyway, this is something that I really want to do. I don't know when, because I already have too much work. But someday in the future, I want to write about his relationship with Brazil, even though he has never been. So that's very interesting. He never went, right? So yes, thank you very much. We still have time, but I'd like to move to Juliet a little bit, and then we can talk more broadly. So Juliet, that's so interesting. I mean, I knew a little bit about your work because we met before, right? But it's very nice. It's nice to see your work like unpacking, developing, like unfolding into new things. I am very interested in this note. The very first question you raised, which is, what is an archive? I think just this question could be an entire dissertation. Could be an entire research project. So I very much enjoy, and I like the way you define vernacular archive. That was for me particularly compelling. And I wrote down a few of your words, and you defined vernacular archive as the archive which is outside formal institutions. This is really interesting. So I have just an observation, and then a wide question for you to talk a bit more. The first observation is, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Gonzalez, Anita Gonzalez. Anita Gonzalez, she works with Black diasporic studies. She works with US and Mexico, Black Mexico, Black US, Black Cuba. But she has a very interesting reading on this non-traditional archives. She's a professor at Georgetown. She has been there for many years. She's a professor in the Department of Black Studies at Georgetown. And it's interesting because their department used to be called African American Studies. They changed to Black Studies because they wanted something more diasporic and more global. So it's But anyway, but the Dr. Gonzalez, Anita Gonzalez, she's this wonderful scholar, professor, and writer and thinker. And she has, I believe, 3 or 4 books about Blackness and performance, Blackness, the archive. There is one book specifically published by Duke University Press called Black Performance Theory. There is one about Mexico specifically called Afro-Mexico Dancing, but she has one called Black Performance Theory. And I was thinking about this discussion as I was listening to you, because Anita Gonzalez does a very interesting discussion. She offers an interesting reflection about how we deal with the body in the context of the archive. And one day I was talking to her, and I said something like, oh, your reading about non-traditional archives is very interesting, very compelling. And she said something brilliant. She said, what is non-traditional? Because if you're calling these archives non-traditional, you're assuming that there is a traditional archive. But then she said something that I never forgot. She told me, in the diasporic context, in the African context, what you're calling non-traditional is the archive. So the body, the language, the performance, all of these things are the archive. And I thought, oh my God, that's right. That's brilliant. I never said non-traditional archive after that. But I think the way you did it in your presentation was way better than the way I did it when I was talking to her. Because way better. Because you referred to the archive outside formal institutions. That's very interesting. And that's exactly what it is, right? Because we have the formal archive of the formal document, which in the Eurocentric context is considered to be the real, and going back to authenticity, the authentic archive, quote. But then you bring this notion of Barracoon as a vernacular archive. That's fascinating. So I think the role of language is definitely very important. So I wanted to give you the suggestion of Anita Gonzalez's work. And you mentioned naming. That's also so fascinating. It's another whole universe of inquiry. When we think about naming in the Afro diaspora, I thought about Phyllis Whitley, right? Whose name was not Phyllis Whitley. She arrived in Massachusetts and she became Phyllis Whitley. And there is one passage in Booker T. Washington's memoir, Up From Slavery, that might be, even though you're working with Hurston, might be helpful just for you to have another example. Because right at the beginning, probably the first or second chapter, right at the beginning, Booker T. Washington says that his name was just Booker. He didn't have look how powerful, he didn't have a last name because he was enslaved. And then Booker T. Washington, of course, he talks about the importance of education, literacy. In the beginning of the book, the memoir, he says, when I went to school for the first time, I noticed that the other kids had last names and he was just Booker. And he narrates a very interesting passage in which the teacher was like calling attendance or calling students, and he didn't know what to say. And the first name that came to his mind was Washington. And then he said, "Oh, I'm Booker Washington." And then he learned afterwards that his mother wanted to give him a last name that started with the letter T. I don't remember what it was. Then he turned it to his middle name, and then Booker T. Washington was born. So that's super interesting, because in this passage, there's a moment in which he says, he says something like, "I'm one of the few people who could choose his own last name," because he chose to be Booker T. Washington because he didn't have a name. So this notion of name is very powerful in the discussion of coloniality within the diasporic world. And the way that you connect naming with language is also interesting. So if you want to, I would like to ask you a bit more this relationship between language and the vernacular archive. And since you are doing your research right now, and I know you're beginning, you don't need to have an answer, but how would you like to approach the issue of language? Because have you thought about that? Because what you discussed at the end about standard English is fascinating. And I think Neil Hurston specifically is a very important figure, because she paves the way for other authors like Alice Walker, for example, right? And if we had Color Purple in the second half of the 20th century, it was in many ways thanks to Their Eyes Are Watching God and many other works by Neil Hurston. So if you could talk a little bit more about how you approach this idea of vernacular archive, how do you intend to conduct this research, and what is the role of language? I'm just giving you some bullet points, and you can explore that as you want.
Well, thank you. Well, that was really insightful. You said a lot of great things, and I took notes of the authors. I would look into them, Anita and Washington. Okay. So about language, I think it's a very complicated phenomenon. It's not very easy to say what it should be or what it shouldn't be. Okay, but I'll just stick to my research for now. So I'm just gonna be focusing on Hester's use of vernacular in Barracoon and her other works as well. So in Barracoon, what drew me to the text was the language of the text. So it is not African American vernacular English. So it is a blend of West African languages and English. So this was a way the survivors of the ship had to communicate, or this was their way of communication. They had to find a way to talk. So they blended what they already knew, what they were familiar with the new language they met here. So this vernacular is, or this dialect is very different from what we see in Their Eyes Were Watching God, or what we see in Toni Morrison's Sula, or any of the other texts that include African American vernacular English. So my interest in Barracoon's language, or Kozola's language, was the fact that Heston preserved it as it was spoken. So that is how we get the vernacular archive. It is from that preservation. Because if she had smoothened it a little bit, if she had tried to make it easily understandable for those who wanted it to be standard English, we wouldn't be getting all the other forms of knowledge that come with this dialect. So for example, with the example I used in my paper about how Kozola would ask Heston, you understand me? This was very frequent. So after every sentence or two, Kozola would ask her, you understand me? And it wasn't to ask Heston if she understood the language he was speaking. It was part of the linguistics of West African languages. Specifically, this was Yoruba. So it's one way Africans communicate. That is by making sure the other person or the listener is very engaged as well. So that narrative logic, that is a characteristic of our communication. And that would have been lost if Heston had taken that out, because it didn't need to be there in the sentences. It could have been left out because it wasn't to check Heston's comprehension. But Heston preserved it and recorded it as he spoke it, exactly as he spoke it. And that is how we get to refer back to our African narrative style. That is how we get to know, oh, this is what Kozola was trying to do. So what made me, so going back to my previous point, what made me so interested in this text is the fact that it was neither African American vernacular English nor standardized English. It had all the African linguistic structures, all the sentences, the clauses. They were preserved as if like exactly as he spoke it. If you read the text, you would think you were listening. It would feel as if you were listening to an African man speak. And I think that is what preserved the vernacular archive I am talking about. Well, I don't know if
That was great. Yeah. And I've been working with global Black studies for a while, and I teach U.S. literature and African American literature, but always in transnational perspectives. And what you're saying is so interesting because you basically described a phenomenon that equally happened in many other parts of the diaspora, in many other languages. And that's super, I mean, what you just said right now, that standard English, African American vernacular, and what's happening in Barracoon, those are three different instances. Yeah. That's fascinating because if you look at the diaspora, and if we situate Barracoon within the larger diaspora, we could think about similar phenomena happening in all the other languages. And there is a very important Colombian poet from the late 19th century called Candelario Obeso. And Candelario Obeso in Colombia, what you said, we could basically copy and paste and adapt to his Spanish. It's so fascinating because Candelario Obeso was born before Zora Neale Hurston. Of course, I mean, he wouldn't have, I think he passed away way before. He passed away in the early 20th century. So before she published anything, Candelario Obeso was writing another language, another context, but still he had a similar relationship with language. And what he did in the Hispanic context was in a certain way similar to what Hurston did in the Anglophone, the English language context. Because Candelario Obeso wrote, I mean, the difference is that he was a poet, but Candelario Obeso wrote poetry trying to emulate or trying to evoke the language of not only Black Colombians, but Black workers that in Colombian Spanish we call los bogas, which was basically the rowers who worked in the river. And they were, it was after emancipation in Colombia, but they were from African descent, and they spoke something between, as you said, African languages and what would be the Spanish vernacular or something like that, but they definitely did not speak standard language. And he wrote in this language, and in the case of Obeso, it's interesting because he wrote this book of poems. He went to Bogota, the capital, to try to be like a legitimate writer. And it was so polemic that his other books were written in standard Spanish. So he wrote just the first book in this, what we could call like Afro-Spanish or something like that. And if we look at other languages, I mean, Haitian Creole, the whole debate surrounding Haitian Creole and how these languages are mixed. The context of French language, it happens as well. And of course, since we are here in Brazilian Portuguese, same thing happened. We have a very important scholar called Lélia Gonzalez in Brazil who developed the concept of Black Portuguese, português, which is very similar. So what I'm trying to say is that I very much enjoy your paper and your work because even focusing the US, it is inherently global in the way that you deal with language and the diaspora. So that's fascinating. Wonderful. Thank you. So we still have some time, and I do want to, benefit from this opportunity as much as I can to learn from you. I just want to show a few comments before we move to the final part. We have here Rita Santos. Oh, and Julie, thank you very much for this really interesting panel. Vera Silva said, congratulations. Rosangela said, great discussion, very high level. And Marcia said, congratulations for your speech. Parabéns pelo discurso. And Dr. Machado, which is one of the coordinators of our lab, he said it's wonderful to see such interesting research presentations here at the symposium. He's one of our coordinators of this event. Okay. All right, so just before we wrap things up, I just want to make a brief comment, and now going back to Dr. Walsh's work. It is interesting that when we think about California in US literature, we immediately think about Steinbeck, right? And we think about Of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath or whatever work. And since I am trained in literature and in the field of comparative literature, I think your work in a certain way is also dealing with the very idea of the canon, right? Because when we think about the West within US literature, it's almost like John Steinbeck is the only possible figure in the early 20th century, or at least the figure because of which we end up overlooking other figures. And I think that your perspective on the West Coast is interesting to put in conversation with going back to the idea of traditional or not traditional, the more traditional West Coast literature. Since when I started studying American literature many years ago, when I was an English major, I learned that John Steinbeck is the figure of California or the figure of the West Coast. And then usually we associate African-American lit in the first half of the 20th century just to Harlem. And then as if they were separated bubbles, right? So I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. I might be wrong, and correct me if it doesn't make sense. But I wanted to listen a little bit more about that. How you, as a historian, how you think about this notion of the canon and the past, and how we associate the West Coast to a very specific type of cultural production.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's I recognize and agree with everything you're saying. And I think that happens not just in literature, it also happens in film, where, again, like so many of the iconic Hollywood productions about the West Coast and about California are kind of primarily white noir or adaptations of Steinbeck novels, or films even that Steinbeck wrote himself sometimes. Steinbeck's, particularly in the period that I'm writing about in the 1930s, Steinbeck's kind of I hesitate to use the word hegemony, but yeah, his ubiquity as like the primary way to access California in the 1930s is a huge problem, and one of the major effects of it is the whitening of that period and that place at that time. So, like elsewhere in the book, I write about the agricultural strike wave in 1933-4, which shook California, and which was the basis of Steinbeck's book Indubious Battle, where he kind of renders this strike wave of primarily agricultural workers in California, who at this time were primarily Mexican, Japanese, Black, Filipino, as well as white. He renders this strike movement as primarily a white strike movement. Langston Hughes wrote a play about the same strike movement, which he was kind of involved with in kind of a tertiary role, as like in solidarity with. He wrote a play with Ella Winter about the same strike wave called Harvest, and the play wasn't produced, which I think is again telling about when we think about archives and we think about what is preserved, where it's preserved, and then what gets remembered. The fact that a play of Hughes's about that strike wave wasn't produced is always in itself is kind of formative then of how we remember that period and that place. And whereas Steinbeck's rendering of that strike wave is heavily whitened, Hughes's is really concerned with preserving the various different kind of radical traditions that were motivating and infusing that strike movement in California, where, I mean, he makes, to be honest, quite a clumsy, but nevertheless he makes an attempt to kind of render Mexican speech and to pay some kind of homage to Mexican revolutionary traditions that were obviously dear to those farm workers. It's very deliberately and stridently a kind of a multiracial cast of characters that are being represented. And I mean, yeah, it definitely speaks to questions around archives, but also more kind of bigger questions for kind of cultural history about kind of what gets produced as well, and therefore what gets celebrated, canonized, and remembered. So there's loads that could be said about that. And yeah, thank you for having me as well, and thanks again to Juliet.
Yeah, no, of course, that is great. And it is interesting because in history and cultural studies and literature and many fields of the humanities, we're constantly talking about how we imagine nationhood, right? So, I mean, imagine communities and all this scholarship that we know. But in that case, within the US, we imagine different parts in different ways, right? So how do we imagine the West Coast? Not Americanness as a national unity, but how do we usually imagine this West Coast? And as you said, how this it's very associated to whiteness. There is a short story, just an observation that I very much enjoy, and I just taught this short story in my American short fiction class, so I have it very clear in my mind, which is a short story named "The Luck of Roaring Camp." It was published by Bret Harte in the mid-19th century. This just a brief observation to connect what you said. This short story was published in 1868, so it's way before the moment we are talking about. But it is interesting because it portrays the gold rush and everything related to gold in California and this movement to the West. And the whole story starts, I mean, it's fascinating, and it's a very rich story to talk about many different topics and gender and race and the idea of wealth. Because the story is basically about a group of white men, like lower class men, who are going there hoping to find gold and you know, become rich and find some wealth with the gold. And the story, they're all men. There is only one woman in this group who is an indigenous woman. And this indigenous woman dies in the first page of the story, but she's pregnant. So she dies, but they save the baby. And the whole story, look how powerful this image is. The whole story is about this group of white men trying to take care of this mixed race baby, who is the son of an indigenous woman, while they want to take that land and take the gold to make wealth. So there is a very interesting, complex discussion going on, because there is an obvious aspect of gender, because as men, they did not want to take care of a baby, because in their mind was a female role, right? So they didn't want to do that. At the same time, it is an indigenous baby that represents very well this metaphor, because they are going to the West Coast, not because they are worried about the West Coast, it's just because they want gold. And spoiler alert, at the end of the story, there is a flood, and one of the white men who is trying to protect the baby, there is a flood, and he dies with the baby. He dies trying to protect the baby, and both die. So it's a very powerful image of this indigenous baby who ends up dying in a flood, so almost like man versus nature. But at the same time, these white men are trying to exploit the land, basically, right? And if we think about California history specifically, the whole debate about indigenous genocide is very powerful in the 19th century, right? So I'm just going a little bit off topic to come back to the topic and talk about this imagination of and race in California. And you mentioned film. I completely agree. How film has also associated that, how California is usually associated not to blackness and not to indigenous communities, but associated to a very specific type of whiteness, right? All right. Thank you so much. So before we wrap up our conversation, I just want to say one, and to be even, I want to make two comments on each paper. there is something that I personally am very interested, and I don't know if it's that relevant for your work, because you already explained very well your relationship with like how you explore language and everything. But you mentioned this idea of African sense of identity and community, something along those lines, right? And
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think Barakun, besides all the linguistic aspect that you explored very well, this notion of what is the self and what is the community is also interesting in African studies in general, but in that work in particular, because the concept of community is definitely different in West Africa and in the so-called Western world or in the US. So
Mhm.
the relationship is interesting. It invites us to think about something that I always tell my students: how African is the African American experience, right? In other words, the African American experience has, of course, the African ancestry, but the concept of community, for example, is not exactly the same for Black Americans and for West Africa, right? So if you could talk a little bit more about this notion of community formation and how you see that in Barakun specifically, I would very much appreciate.
Of course. Thank you. Yeah. So that is a big part of it, and that is like the second half of my argument. So I specifically looked at the formation of Africa Town, and
Yeah.
this is because of the community. And as you rightly said, the concept of community is different, like for Africans and for the West, the Western world. So, in Africa, our worldview, in our African worldview, community is a very important part of it. So, while the West is more individualistic, um, Africans are more, or West Africans specifically, are more communal. And this seeps into the African American worldview as well. So, although it would not be the same, I wouldn't say it's the same, there's similarities. So, as we saw in Barakun, the Clotilda survivors, after they learned that slavery was over, and that was around 1960s, they, 1860s. Oh, okay. They decided, okay, they wanted to go back to Africa because they hadn't been here for long. They got here. Well, I'm getting my dates very confused. So they got here around 60s, 59, 60s, and then they were enslaved for a very short period of time. So around 65, they were told slavery was no more. So these people had not been here for as long as the other African Americans had been here, because by then there were new generations of African Americans, those who were enslaved way before. And in Barakun, we see a difference between the Clotilda survivors and the previously enslaved and their new generations. Okay, so let me come back to the Clotilda survivors. So after they realized they couldn't go back to West Africa, they had no choice but to create their own Africa here. And that is how they started the formation of Africa Town. Mm-hmm. And they had to buy land from their slave master because he wouldn't give them land. And they pooled their resources together. They did this as a community. They made sure everybody had a place. They made sure everybody had a house. They got themselves, like I mentioned, they got themselves a leader. They had rules, and they had They built a school. All that they did together. They knew one another. And this started even before they got onto the soils of America, right from the ship, right from the barracoon, even to go back to before they were even shipped, before the Middle Passage, they had bonded. It's not hard for Africans to bond just because of our spirit of community and our worldview. So they already had that bond. And then when they got here, even when they were separated, when they were given different masters, they still managed to come back together. Also, emphasizing the community. Yeah, so that is a very deep part of it. And yes, we see that similarity in African Americans as well. It's just not the same because in texts like Sula, in texts like Beloved, we see that Africana worldview there too. We see African Americans trying to bond, forming a community, being there for one another. All that we see that too. Yeah, so I would say it stems from the African roots. It is our worldview, and that is very different from the West.
Excellent. Yeah. And thanks for bringing Beloved and Sula. Toni Morrison is always welcome and it's always important. Yeah, I think you put it in a very, very interesting way, how these African-American communities try to build this sort of Afrocentric sense of community, right? And that's, I mean, what I meant before when I said like how African is the African-American experience. I was thinking exactly in this sort of almost a certain tension, right? Something that Du Bois would define as a double consciousness, but
Yeah.
this idea of like Black Americans are developing a sense of community and community and the sense of community that they belong to this group that evokes a certain West African sense, but at the same time they are both geographically and socially in a different context, right?
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Actually, I'm always talking about Langston Hughes. My apologies. But talking about Langston Hughes again, there is an interesting path. He went to Africa many times and he wrote about Africa a few times. And there is a passage in The Big Sea, his first autobiography, in which he says that he arrives in West Africa. And the African he said something like, "Oh, we Black need to blah, blah, blah." And the West African says, "You are a white man." And he was not recognized as part of that group. And that's a very interesting passage because, first of all, Langston Hughes was not dark-skinned. So in West Africa, he was not perceived as Black. And also, I think it reviews this very interesting connection, right? That there is a sense, there is something that connects all of us from the continent and from the diaspora. But at the same time, there is something else going on. So the way that you're dealing with this, I think is very nuanced and it's very good. Americana, if I'm not mistaken, there is a moment in which she says that the character arrives in the U.S. and there are two different groups in the U.S. campus: African Americans and Africans in America. And these are two different. And I think that's to Amanda is a good example of how, as an African woman who made a career in the U.S. and she's constantly navigating this. And for us in Latin America, it's the same thing. We are Black Latin Americans. How African is the Afro-Colombian? How African is the Afro-Brazilian? How African is... And we are, I mean, if you think about language, religion, food, we definitely are quite African while navigating a different national. So thanks for your answer, very insightful about this idea of community. And I'm especially grateful that you mentioned Morrison because I think it's a perfect connection. All right, so we are almost over. Let me see our chat here. We have another comment from Rosangela. I'm so proud to participate in the international event. Congratulations to offer this opportunity to us, Brazilian teachers and graduate students from Brazil. And then she said, in the other side, improving my English abilities. Yes, wonderful. Thanks a lot. Wonderful. Yeah, we are all learning a lot from Dr. Walsh and Juliet, while we are practicing our English as well. So it was really great. Let me see if Dr. Rodrigues, Renata, are you there? So if you want to say something, both, let me open here. Dr. Rodrigues, Renata is here. Dr. Machado, Felipe, if you want to say something. Thank you so much. And Juliet, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your availability to share your work. I'm happy that I had this opportunity to learn again. Do you have any final thoughts, concluding remarks?
I'm so happy I was able to join this. That's my first virtual conference, so very happy, and it went great. Thank you so much. And I must say, I really enjoyed your insights. I enjoyed your questions and your comments. They were so great. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Walsh. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. No, I can send you an email with the references I mentioned, Juliet.
Oh, yeah. That would be great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Of course. And if you are not familiar with Christina Sharp, In the Wake, this is a very interesting book as well. I'm gonna send you.
I've definitely heard this before.
Yeah,
so, yes.
For your work, it will be interesting. Okay. And Dr. Walsh, anything you'd like to say?
I think I'm out, but it's been great to join you guys. Thanks for the invitation. Hopefully see you again at some events in the future.
We will. I hope to see you both, and I hope to see you in person as well in the future in this virtual world that we have. So thank you so much, Owen, for Juliet, Dr. Walsh for joining us. I will bring Dr. Rodrigues here just to conclude the table, the panel. Sorry, this is the panel. And Walsh and Juliet, I will put you in the backstage for a second. Okay. So thank you again. Renata, would you like to say something? Yes. Renata, tá me ouvindo? Do you hear me?
Agora sim. Agora eu ouço.
Fique à vontade. Se quiser falar da próxima mesa, inclusive.
Sim, assim, na verdade, agradecer a mesa, interessantíssima. Eu não tenho altas habilidades do inglês para falar, mas para entender a discussão foi muito bacana. Então, eu queria agradecer a Owen e a Juliet. E convidar todos para daqui a alguns minutinhos, daqui a aproximadamente meia hora, para a mesa 4, encerrando o nosso simpósio. Agradecer a presença de quem ficou, de quem voltou. A gente sabe que depois do almoço é complicado, é corrido, tem Copa do Mundo no meio, mas a gente agradece a presença de todo mundo. E daqui a pouco, a professora Ana Flávia Magalhães, da UNB, e o escritor Alan da Rosa conosco aqui.
É isso aí, a gente se vê daqui a pouquinho. A próxima mesa começa às 16 horas de Brasília. Então, muito obrigado a todo mundo que acompanhou. Thank you so much for everybody who joined us today for this panel. And yeah, see you soon. Até a próxima. Até 4 horas a gente volta. Tchau.